Good. It is great to have a packed house. Welcome. I'm Anthony Crowell, Dean and President here at the law school, and it is a great pleasure to welcome you tonight as we join this special program featuring Nicole Gelinas, one of New York's most preeminent chroniclers and commentators of municipal policy for the past several decades. Thank you for being with us tonight. Nicole will discuss her fantastic and important new book, Movement, New York City's Long War to Take Back Its Streets from the Car. And following her talk, she will take some questions from Ben Max, veteran journalism and executive editor and program director of our Center for New York City and State Law, which is hosting tonight's program. And then we will get questions from all of you here in our audience. The center builds upon 30 years of legacy built by our Center for New York City Law, founded by Samuel Seabury, professor of law and transportation leader Ross Sandler. And the center has expanded its focus recently to include the impact that state law has on the city's laws, operations, and administration. I'm proud to serve as the center's faculty director now, with Ross as our founding director, Ben and the entire team to provide more meaningful conversations and engagement on the most pressing matters facing New York. And tonight's program is special for a couple of other reasons. That includes that Nicole's book couldn't have been published at a better time, as New York City is about to be subject to congestion pricing administered by the MTA. And this book is exciting for our NYLS community, as Nicole highlights the importance of the legal advocacy led by Ross and NYLS Professor Emeritus David Schoenbrod in the 1970s as they litigated critical environmental matters under the Clean Air Act. Her book recognizes how they paved the way for the city's transportation planning and eventually led Mayor Koch appointing Ross as the city's transportation commissioner. And overall, this book is an indispensable addition to the most prominent works covering the history of New York City's development over the past half century. For decades, Robert Caro's masterpiece, The Power Broker, was the defining work chronicling the city's leaders and advocates who have shaped New York. And now Nicole's book extends that history to the present day while reframing and recontextualizing some of the history covered by Caro. The focus of Nicole's talk today, as we are at New York Law School, focuses on the legal battles and laws such as the ones led by Ross and David that shape so much of the transportation and environmental policies developed over the past 5 decades. And as a law school with a center focused on state and local law and policy, and nationally, NYLS having the second highest number of law graduates entering public service each year, we have a deep appreciation and understanding of the issues covered in this book. I have no doubt that this work will become as essential to understanding New York as The Power Broker is, and will be required reading for any student looking to work in urban planning or public policy, as well as all of us who are currently engaged in this work. And for me personally, first working as a city law department attorney and then as counsel to Mayor Bloomberg, and now dean of this law school, I've always appreciated Nicole's prescient analysis and coverage of a wide range of pressing urban matters, and I am so glad she is with us tonight. We're grateful to her for sharing her time, and I know this will be an extraordinary discussion. The Center of New York City Law will be hosting one more program before we break for the holidays, and I encourage you all to attend, and that will be as we host City Council Minority Leader Joe Borelli on Tuesday, December 17th for a City Law breakfast as he discusses his thoughts on New York and the incoming Trump administration. Now I'll ask Ben to come up and more formally introduce Nicole and thank everyone for joining us. Really appreciate you being here.
Been taking this with me everywhere I go for the last couple of weeks, and it's definitely given me a good workout. So thanks, Dean Crowell. Thank you all for being here. This is a fantastic turnout for this event. I am going to speak very briefly because you're here to hear from Nicole, so we're looking forward to her presentation. As the dean said, Nicole will give a presentation, and then she and I will chat for just a few minutes, and then we're going to open it up to lots of audience questions. So get those ready as Nicole is speaking. I'll just ask her a couple quick ones, and then we'll turn it over to the audience because I'm sure the people in this room will have very interesting and probing questions for her. I just want to say again, part of the reason that we're here for this event with Nicole is because of Ross Sandler's work And Ross is here. And hopefully we'll have a question or maybe make a comment when we get to audience participation in just a little bit. Nicole Gelinas is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a contributing editor of its City Journal, and a columnist at the New York Post. If you're in this room tonight, you've probably read some of her work, if not a lot of it. She writes on urban economics, infrastructure, finance, and really everything New York City, and at times beyond New York City. And now she is, of course, the author of Movement, New York's Long War to Take Back Its Streets from the Car. Nicole, come on up.
Good evening. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Dean. So most audience, thank you, that I speak to are interested in bike lanes, pedestrian plazas, bus lanes, speed cameras, but a big focus of the book is policy through the law, particularly federal law and the framework of federal law that has developed, and people like Ross learning to use that framework of federal law that has developed over the half century since the late 1960s, early 1970s. And this has changed the way that New York thinks about and approaches transportation policy, politics, and activism, but is often a forgotten part of this story. I spend a lot of time talking about political fights and people and elections and why do we have these bike lanes, and not so much about what I found one of the most interesting parts of doing the research and writing the book, and hopefully you will as well. Now, these slides are more visual aids than they are PowerPoint bullet points. I've spent the last 8 weeks in criminal court, so I've learned to make exhibits. So these are more like exhibits than a PowerPoint presentation. So the old way of doing things in the first 60 years or so of the 20th century was direct retail politics, direct retail activism in changing transportation policy in New York City, often on a very hyper-local neighborhood scale. So here we are in the 1950s, and I would ask if you take pictures of the slides, that's fine, but don't post them on the internet because we don't want to go to copyright prison. So here we are in the early 1950s, 1953. The city of New York wanted to widen a road through Washington Square Park. Shirley Hayes, former off-Broadway actress, homemaker in Greenwich Village, sitting in the park, watching her children, sees this article in the New York Times, city's gonna widen this road, and says, yeah, that's not a very good idea, and while we're at it, maybe we shouldn't have a road at all in Washington Square Park. So we'll get rid of the existing road through the park, because buses actually went right through Washington Square Park. So this was ultimately successful, not to give away the story, but it took 15 years. It took most of the 1950s and a little bit of the 1960s. And how did Shirley Hayes and her neighbors do this? It was long and arduous, but simple. Create a credible threat and a credible risk that voters in the village and in wider Manhattan would vote on this issue, that they did not want this wider road through the park, that they wanted the existing road demapped and destroyed, and that they could garner enough votes to actually pose a threat to elected officials. So they got the petition signed of 30,000 people, a third of Greenwich Village's population, and they made this into a long-standing political issue on the neighborhood issue, on the neighborhood level, on the borough level, and on the city level. And actually, Carmine DeSapio, the district leader of the village, he needed that elected position in order to maintain his power base as the head of the Manhattan political machine. He eventually lost his seat and lost to Ed Koch, in large part because of this Washington Square Park road issue. So it worked. It became enough of a threat also to the borough president and later to Mayor Wagner that they had to pay attention. So when people talk about how do you beat Robert Moses? Robert Moses was the public face of this project as the Parks Commissioner. But Shirley Hayes figured out a decade before Jane Jacobs did, you don't beat Moses by going after Moses. Moses is just there as a shield for the politicians to hide behind. You beat Moses by going around him. You put your pressure directly on the elected officials. And this worked. The road was demapped and taken away, and there's no road anymore in Washington Square Park. So this did not involve the law, really, at all. Same thing with the Lower Manhattan Expressway. A decade later, this played out largely in the second half of the 1960s. This was Jane Jacobs' fight against Moses, although that's a superficial way of looking at it. Jane Jacobs had learned her lessons from watching the Washington Square Park fight play out as a resident of the village in the 1950s, helping Shirley Hayes in her own project. Jacobs applied these lessons to the Lower Manhattan Expressway. I put up the full headline so that you could see a lot of stuff was going on. You have to see events in the context in which they happen. So notable that this made the front page of the New York Times in 1969, even with a lot of other global events in the news. So how did Jane Jacobs and her coalition defeat the Lower Manhattan Expressway, 10-lane expressway that would have gone, as the name suggests, across Lower Manhattan, obliterate parts of Soho and Little Italy? She really didn't do it by going after Robert Moses. The anti-expressway forces succeeded in putting the pressure on Mayor Lindsay. Mayor Lindsay, as well as the governor, had the ultimate authority over this project. Lindsay took office in 1965, actually, or he won the election in 1965, took office in 1966, pledging that he would cancel the Lower Manhattan Expressway. When he took office, he dithered on it. He delayed, he stalled. He quickly realized upon becoming mayor, he didn't want to alienate the labor unions, the business community. Large swaths of institutional New York really wanted this expressway built. On the other hand, he didn't want to alienate the people who had voted for him on this issue. So he did what a lot of elected officials do when they can't make a decision: delay. He commissioned a study that said maybe we should do a tunnel instead, even though everyone knew even then that was not going to work. So he managed to continue these delays until he was up for re-election, 1969. A tough vote. He needed to keep the people who had supported him the first time. They wanted him to cancel this expressway. And sort of an exhausted press conference in July, someone said, "What's going on with the expressway?" He said, "I think it's dead for all time." And 2 years later, it was demapped. So this was an elected official decision. The mayor had the position of more strength because it was in the core part of New York City. Then did the governor. Once Lindsay canceled it, that was that. There was no law, no legal mechanisms involved in this, just pure wholesale and retail politics. So this is 1969, significant year. What worked in killing these pre-NEPA, pre-Clean Air Act, pre-Clean Water Act projects? Again, everything we just talked about. At the same time, in the 1960s, people were becoming aware of just the highways that we had built were not working. They were not reducing traffic. They were not improving quality of life. Yes, of course you need highways. No one's going to say we're going to cut New York City off from the automobile, but wider roads and roads through ever denser parts of the city were not producing a good real world result for New York City. So, you know, sometimes we like to say we did the right intellectual thing. We really didn't. We did the wrong thing until the results were so obvious that we just sort of had to stop doing it. So what worked was to do the right thing. Doing the wrong thing for a very long time worked. Another thing is public awareness, particularly in Manhattan and in New York City, about the toxic effects of smog. You know, this was not invisible carbon dioxide where people have to have abstract thoughts to understand the danger that it poses. This was particulate that you could see in the air, you could feel on your face. People would come home and find their windowsills covered in soot, even if they had cleaned it the night before. So an understanding that this had an immediate and debilitating impact on public health, and one of the key drivers of smog was motor vehicles. Others were incinerators. In understanding, we don't want to encourage more motor vehicle drivers to drive into the core parts of the city. This is Hazel Henderson. She passed away last year. She got advertising firms to produce pro bono ads and had them placed in major newspapers alongside the ads for the cars. Of course, the automakers paid for these ads, so she sort of scored a coup in having the contrasting ad in the same pages of the newspaper. So these things were on people's minds. They contributed to the defeat of the Lower Manhattan Expressway, but they also resulted in the political movement that got us new federal laws. So what are our new federal laws? NEPA, Environmental Policy Act, became passed in 1969, became law in 1970. Very briefly, it meant a lot more transparency for federally funded large-scale public works projects. The projects would have to produce statements, and statement is an understatement, about what might be the impacts, what would the alternatives be, and so forth. Clean Air Act. There were Clean Air Acts before 1970, but as Ross told me for the book, and turned out to be true, this had a right of private action. So if the federal government didn't do what it said it was going to do under the Clean Air Act, people, nonprofits, institutions could sue and force the federal government to do these things. Clean Air Act, in turn, mandated that states put out and execute a program to reduce their emissions. And New York State, the main actor in that was New York City. And of course, the Clean Water Act, 1972, made a much higher bar that projects had to hurdle before building anything that touched important or even unimportant waterway. So a new framework of federal laws to a new tool for people, groups, institutions that wanted to defeat projects that they hadn't had before, 3 new tools. So what does this mean in practice? How do we get from the Clean Air Act of the early 1970s to funding the MTA, rebuilding the mass transportation system in the early 1980s? Seems like a bit of a leap. So as Ross kindly explained to me for the book and is laid out in a chapter of the book, when the Clean Air Act passed, New York had to produce its plan to comply with the required fall in emissions. To do that, it put out what it called a transportation control plan. 1973, New York City, as the main driver of pollution, had a major role in that plan. So the plan, largely written by Brian Ketchum, transportation engineer who just passed away a few months ago. Under the plan, New York itself committed to doing things on the city streets like reduce parking, both legal and illegal street parking, particularly in Manhattan. If people couldn't park, they wouldn't drive. Things like put tolls on the East River bridges may sound familiar, sort of early prototype for congestion pricing. If you cannot drive over the free bridges, that obviously discourages car traffic into Manhattan. Things like bus lanes, a whole slew of, kind of the things that we've gotten used to in terms of traffic calming, traffic mitigation, all put out in this plan. The mayor submitted it to Rockefeller. Rockefeller submitted it to the federal government. That was sort of that, except as Ketchum was dismayed to learn, the state and city were not actually serious about implementing this plan. They thought, or maybe they thought, no one was going to force them. Here comes along the NRDC, Ross, David, being entrepreneurial environmental lawyers and actually suing to have this plan put in place. And this was good in that you actually have credible sanctions. If you ignore the federal law, that's good. But it was not so good in that as the Lindsay administration turned into the Beam administration, Beam could kind of use the federal government as a foil, as a villain, that the federal government was, once the judge ruled, yes, you do have to implement this plan, the federal government was forcing New York to do things that it did not want to do. The big bad federal government was forcing the city to get rid of parking. This was going to harm the economy. Beam had a kind of handy villain to focus people's attention on rather than focus on the city's own failures. So this went on for a little while, and as Ross and David said in the New York Times at the time and said in the book, they did not want a legal victory at the expense of actually getting things done on a practical schedule, on a practical basis that would begin to improve the air. One of the most important things was rebuilding the transit system so that people began riding the subway, riding commuter rail, riding the bus instead of taking their own cars into Manhattan. 1970s was a period where the number of people coming into Manhattan fell, but the number of vehicles continued to increase. So fewer people, more pollution, not a good outcome. So over time, the law showed that it could not be entirely divorced from the state and local real world political situation. And so a compromise was reached wherein the state would commit to refunding and rebuilding the MTA, the bridge tolls, the main boogeymen sort of then and now were taken away by an amendment to the Clean Air Act sponsored by Senator Moynihan and Congresswoman Elizabeth Holtzman, although they did have the support of most of the in fact, all of the outer borough congressional delegation. So, an example of sort of last minute rescue from congestion pricing may sound familiar. So through the application of the federal law, but also a practical on the ground understanding of what was actually possible in the New York political and policy world, the Clean Air Act, through this sort of Rube Goldbergian long, decade-long process, this was a real point of leverage that Richard Ravitch could use in convincing the state legislature, convincing the governor to enact business taxes to refund the MTA, really convincing the business community that if we did not do this, we would be going against this compromise that was part of complying with the federal law. And that also meant, in another complex way, that we would put a project greatly favored by the business community, by the labor community at risk. And that project was Westway. In other words, unless we prove to the federal government that we are complying with the Clean Air Act, and we are complying with the Clean Air Act in part by funding the MTA, you put federal approval for Westway at risk. So that worked out well in one respect. We had a much better funded MTA that in turn became the base of the city's jobs recovery, tax-based recovery, population recovery that began in the 1980s. So that brings us to the other project, Westway. As you might have noticed, we don't have Westway. So the other half of that sort of fund the MTA and we can have Westway didn't work out so well from the perspective of the Westway proponents. So when most people think about Westway, they think about Marcy Benstock. She played a critical role in building the coalitions that ultimately defeated this highway project. Highway project announced in the early 70s was not defeated until 1985. So, just like Shirley Hayes getting rid of the road in Washington Square Park, these things take a very long time. One note about Westway, we tend to blame Robert Moses for all of our highway mistakes. This was proposed and state and city government tried to execute it when Moses had no more power, despite the political demise of Moses. The city and state thought it was a good idea to try to build one last highway through Manhattan. The good thing about this highway was that it was supposed to be underground, under new landfill along the Hudson River. Of course, that didn't mitigate the fact that it would still dump tens of thousands of vehicles into a borough that couldn't handle those vehicles, and above 42nd Street, it would dump them off into city avenues that would not be widened for the highway. So that same old problem with highways is that they really don't belong in urban areas. So how was Westway defeated? The Westway opponents did put pressure on, direct political pressure on local elected officials. And that worked in that some Manhattan borough officials, they were certainly against Westway, but they were not powerful enough to kill the project. Ed Koch was against Westway until he was for it. Once he secured his mayoral election, Koch was for Westway because he thought he had to give something to the business community, and the city just did not have a lot of money. This seemed like a project where you procure federal funding and you spread it around New York City at a time when the city just did not have a lot of money to spread around for to gain institutional political support from various constituencies. So the direct political action in New York City was not working. Thankfully, over a very long process, you had NEPA. What did NEPA do? It gave opponents of the project a lot of information. They could sort of partly kill the project with all of these documents that the state had to put out that said what the project said it was going to do in many instances was just not correct. The actual factual documents that they put out said the opposite of what the booster elected and business officials were saying. So that was important. But the most important part was the Clean Water Act, that under the act, the Congress's will was that if there were an alternative route for this highway project, it could not secure a permit from the Army Corps of Engineers to take away a part of the Hudson River and cover it with toxic dredged landfill. So Colonel Griffiths, who was the Army Corps of Engineer colonel in charge of investigating major aspect of this project, whether Westway in fact would harm the life in the Hudson River, had to go out there and this that with which most people are familiar. I actually talked to him in 2019, the year before he passed away. He said he was under tremendous pressure to approve this permit. A lot of pressure. Daniel Patrick Moynihan barged into his office, really leaned on him to grant this permit. He did grant the permit, although he says it's not because of the pressure, and he also left a very long paper trail for that permit to be overturned, something to keep in mind. Sometimes government officials are sort of working, maybe not working for the opposite side, but they are leaving clues for the opposition to sort of come back and defeat them with. So more complex than sometimes things seem superficially. But it was overturned in federal court. The Judge Grisey, pretty simple decision for a complex case that the pro-Westway forces had outright lied about the impact on the Hudson River. Those lies could not stand up in federal court. They got several chances to go back and remedy those lies. They did not do it. Why did they not do it? The state and city seemed confident that because this was such an important project, because the Reagan administration nominally supported it, the governor, first Kerry, then Cuomo supported it, Koch supported it, the Rockefellers, the business community, a federal judge was not going to stand in the way that this would be a pro forma decision. The federal judge did stand in the way. So important lesson, the federal law was less pervious to state and local pressure than were state and local governments. That's a good thing. But the city, it is pause for thought that the opponents of this project could not use the normal political, local, and state channels to defeat the project. And Colonel Griffiths told me if the project had had 90-10 public support, he thinks it would have gone through, but because it was 50-50, the judge could use that discretion to say, this is not something that overwhelmingly the public wants. So again, maybe the politics did continue to play a bigger role than the superficial result would dictate. But the end result was the same. A project that most people did not want was defeated, but the process through which this happened in the nationalization of what in a healthy political system should have been achieved through the state and local political system, you needed to lean on and to use these federal laws. And they certainly ultimately worked. So that's good. Finally, congestion pricing. So since he's not here, we can call Ezra a kind of useful idiot on this topic in this article. The congestion pricing program, another example of the good aspects and the bad aspects of having to do these type of projects which have federal funding, even past federal funding, under a framework of federal environmental law. So congestion pricing signed into law by Governor Cuomo, April 2019. What happens? It has to go through the federal environmental review process. Well, Cuomo immediately starts blaming the Trump administration for delaying this process. The Trump administration won't give them an answer on what level of environmental review that they need to do. So on the one hand, you can say, well, this just proves that these environmental laws are out of date. They require too much paperwork, years of research, reams of data. We can just dispense with this because we know that this is a good project. Well, this misses two things. Cuomo, in my view, was purposely hiding behind this project because he wanted to have it both ways. He got the credit from the transit advocates, from the environmental advocates for signing this into law, but he could push off to a later date, and perhaps a much later date, actually having to take the blowback from drivers and businesses for beginning to implement the tolls. He could blame Trump, and lo and behold, Trump is gone. The state still manages to squeeze out another 2 years of delays under the Biden administration. And here's Ezra saying, we know this is a good idea. Why do we need all this information? We actually did need the information that came out of the federal required environmental assessment for congestion pricing told us important things that the proponents did not tell us, that this might put another 700 trucks onto the Cross Bronx Expressway, that traffic in certain areas of the city, including all of Staten Island, and outside of the city, including much of northern New Jersey, would not actually fall. Whether you support or oppose congestion pricing, these were important things to know, and the state and the MTA would not have told you voluntarily. And that information did help people in the Bronx to mitigate that impact on the Bronx. So here we are, environmental review has passed, the governor goes ahead, then she pauses it, then she unpauses it. Still a couple of lawsuits outstanding as we get to the purported start of congestion pricing, January 5th. Again, going back to where the law meets politics, I think most of you know, state of New Jersey is suing over congestion pricing. Very easy to demonize them and say they shouldn't be abusing the environmental process. The state of New York and the MTA could have at least tried to solve this through the political process. New Jersey actually has a point. Every piece of by-state transportation decision-making is done through the Port Authority. New Jersey commuters already pay congestion pricing, and that they pay peak hour tolls to go under those tunnels. Surpluses from those tolls goes to fund parallel mass transit, and there won't really be any benefit from congestion pricing in New Jersey. So New York acknowledging that New Jersey has a real harm being done to it here and making a political deal. We don't know if it would have stopped this lawsuit, but at least they could have tried. So New York is sort of also hiding behind this environmentally related lawsuit. It could be solved in a different way. And who knows what's ultimately going to happen. So to conclude, then I'll be very, very curious to see what Ben and the audience has to say. What does this all mean? The gradual move toward relying on federal environmental law framework to approach state and local projects, it's good, and that there's redundancy in policy activism. If you fail on the state and local level, you get another bite at it, and in some cases, many bites. There's much more transparency. All of those tens of thousands of pages are actually useful in many ways. What's not so good is it creates an accountability sink. State and local politicians can deflect blame. As Cuomo told me for the book, when you don't want to do projects, that environmental review process, that can take years and years and years, and you can say, well, I'm doing it, but this is taking a long time. When you want to do it, you can make that process happen very, very quickly. It also weakens state and local scale retail politics and activism. We don't expect very much of our local officials because we don't need them. For example, congestion pricing. When the governor put this on pause, the instinct of the advocates was to sue her that's fine. But no one said she could pause it because this law was put into the state budget. Progressive lawmakers could, on the last day of the session, could have put forward a standalone congestion pricing bill with a firm start date and effectively forced her to do it. But everyone's attention was on the lawsuit and the courts and not on, are the progressives having it both ways? They can say they want congestion pricing, but they don't actually have to do anything politically to get it. And finally, scapegoating environmental laws when it seems that they are the thing that is in the way when we want to do something or when we don't want to do something. So going back to Ezra, it's fine to say, oh, you know, NEPA is a problem because it's preventing us from doing congestion pricing. But what that's going to get you is you still won't get congestion pricing if New York politicians won't want it, but you're going to make it easier to dig a coal mine somewhere. I mean, you are playing into the hands of people who want NEPA reformed for different reasons from what you want NEPA reformed for. And I'm sure there's lots of other stuff. So happy to end there and talk to Ben.
Thank you. All right, just a couple of questions from me, and get your questions ready because we're going to turn it over to you very quickly here. You gave us a great talk there on some of the legal battles and aspects of what's in the book. Say just a little bit more, or give a little bit more just scope about what else is chronicled here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's something for everyone. So everyone should read the book. And even, you know, the subtitle, The War Against the Car, even if you love your car and you drive in Manhattan, if you want to know where did we get these bike lanes, where did we get the bus lanes, where did we get the pedestrian plazas that are in the way, you should still read the book to learn more about the other side. So I go through the Bloomberg years, Times Square pedestrianization, right up through and beyond COVID, but also people who like history, kind of revisiting the Robert Moses era, that he was, you know, even things like the buses on the parkways. Robert Moses did not want buses on parkways, but he did not like large vehicles on parkways. And in 1946, year after World War II ended, he was writing letters to generals stationed on Governor's Island saying, get your military vehicles off of my parkways. And they did it. So this had nothing to do with the buses. This was a broader parkway issue for him. So, you know, Moses stuff.
You might be selling that part a little bit short, that it's a significant recasting of some of the legacy, the power broker narrative. We won't go into it now, but that's a very interesting part of it. Why?
Well,
take a sip of water if you need to. That was a short question.
That kind of goes into what we were just talking about, that we tend to obsess about the Moses era. So I got to thinking, Moses has had no power. Oh, sure. Moses lost power in 1968. He died in the early 1980s. He has been gone for a long time. The era since we stopped building new highways is actually longer than the era when we were building and expanding these highways. So rather than continue to obsess about the mid 1920s till the late 1960s, something must have happened from the late 1960s until now. So let's actually see what's happened in these decades. And I thought these were interesting things that should be recorded for history. You know, the process of rebuilding and refunding the transit system. Why did Bloomberg become interested in transportation and street issues? Because this was an important part of improving the city's quality of life once we had started to successfully tackle the crime issue. So just lots of interesting factors that we hadn't thought about in the transportation world.
You said something in your talk about government doing the wrong thing for a very long time, eventually leading to doing the right thing. As you looked at this scope of history, do you have takeaways about how government can do better about doing the right thing earlier and finding both consensus from the public, but more of a future-oriented thinking about what it means to be a thriving global city, or even a small city somewhere, but lessons that this scope helps bring to the fore?
Yeah, it could. It often doesn't. I think one key ingredient for getting New Yorkers to accept anything new and anything experimental is people have to feel that there is a good base of the government having control over crime, public safety, and public order. That's a big reason why Bloomberg was able to do things that we're really looking more into the future and really making big changes on the streets rather than just chase after crisis after crisis after crisis. I mean, Koch was consumed by recovery from the fiscal crisis. Giuliani was consumed by cutting crime. Dinkins in the middle was also consumed by setting up the conditions, increasing attacks to hire more police officers to begin to address the public safety situation. It wasn't really until the Bloomberg era and the middle of the Bloomberg era that you could sort of take a breath and say, okay, we're not in a permanent crisis anymore. What are some positive long-term things we can do rather than chase fire after fire? So if you want to achieve long-term goals, the short-term situation should be pretty good. That's one thing. And I think the other thing is we are not good at addressing a short way of saying it is things take a very long time to just have one transportation goal, even something as modest as building bike lanes. These are things that take years and years and years to build the support for and see how they work out. It's not something, for example, the Koch put in place bike lanes, immediately got rid of them. These are long-term, not only infrastructure, but political and policy projects.
And last one for me, and then we welcome people to the microphone that's just been set up over here, please. So we have the Robert Moses era that's been chronicled. We now have your book chronicling since. Look ahead a bit. What do you foresee in this battle and the question around how New York uses its public realm, around mass transit, around the car culture? What's the next couple of decades maybe going to be about?
I think if there's one thing we can learn from the whole history of the 20th century and the first quarter of the 21st century, New York is not doing well when people prefer to be in their cars rather than be in transit. So we can't fix the problem if we are being coercive about it. In other words, it should not be a punishment to take transit. In the 1970s, people saw it as a punishment, and for good reason. The infrastructure was falling apart. There was massive crime on the transit system. I mean, we had a double-digit number of homicides every year, starting in the 70s and continuing through the 80s. This has to be something that people want to do. So until and unless we get people back on the transit system in pre-COVID numbers or using other alternate forms of transportation besides the car, it's not a good thing that car traffic in the city has more than recovered from pre-COVID levels and transit traffic has not. So that is a hurdle in addressing that issue before we can have a real robust recovery. But the answer can't be people want to use their cars. Let's just make it easier for them to use their cars. Not to say, again, we're not going to have no cars, but on the margins, you want a steady decrease, which we had from the late 90s up until the eve of COVID, rather than a steady increase.
Okay, let's turn it over to audience questions. We're going to take a whole bunch here, and hopefully everybody can stick around for a bit. And then as soon as we're done with audience Q&A, there's copies of the book in the back, and Nicole will be happy to sign books for folks that purchase them. One quick note, please do the best you can to not give a speech at the mic. We have a lot of people that want to ask questions, so please, as quickly as you can, to get to your question. Thank you. Please, go ahead.
7 years ago. So Nicole, first, thank you. I don't always agree with you, but I always appreciate your writing and your analysis. As someone who, spilled a lot of blood, sweat, and tears on congestion pricing, most publicly during the Bloomberg years, but behind the scenes also. Okay, let's say we get that done. Two questions are really on my mind, and I would love your thoughts on this. And they are both about, one is winning the win.
Winning the
win. I am tremendously concerned that we are giving all the sticks and none of the carrots, right? And then secondly, where do we find that next $15 to $20 billion for the next capital program, which we need like tomorrow?
Yeah, I think you identify both parts of your questions. Both parts of your question are related in that when Sam Schwartz and Charles Komanoff started talking about congestion pricing, reviving it after it failed in the Bloomberg era, the pitch was, yes, people will pay to drive into Manhattan, but in return, we are going to get a noticeably, radically better transportation or transit system. We're going to build bike bridges. We're going to have much better bus service. That is not what we're getting now. We are levying congestion pricing to maintain the transit system that we have. And as you say, this only funds the capital program that is ending in 3 weeks. So immediately the state and the MTA are going to have to go to the public and say, we need billions of dollars in more taxes, in more fees. And that is a tough sell, and it does risk harming the public reception of congestion pricing. So I think one of the issues I haven't brought up is at some point we have to address the cost side. Back in the 1980s, when Ravitch was first convincing the state legislature to levy this first slew of half a dozen taxes for the MTA, you could fairly say the problem was a lack of revenue. Those taxes have more than kept up with inflation. We have levied many new taxes, including the 2009 payroll tax. We don't address the cost side. Our costs are not competitive with any European, any developed Asian transit system, and you can't keep adding a new tax or fee every 5 years without eventually addressing costs, and you're harming political support for things that you need to do.
So
Sorry, we gotta move on. We gotta move on.
Quick follow-up.
I'll talk to you after.
If we do need more revenue, where does it come from?
Apologies, we got a long line and we were.
Okay.
At the same time that New York was looking at these issues, as you described them, you had two other cities of roughly comparable geography and size and smaller populations closer to Manhattan's, San Francisco and Boston. Both chose radically different approaches. San Francisco, they tore down the Embarcadero Freeway, similar to what our arguments were over Westway. Boston did the big dig. Now, in looking at these kinds of things, the question is, getting back to the issue of money, how does one go about possibly getting a larger share of out of the, not out of the pocket, I'm sorry, they get federal subsidies for more of the fare not to be paid for out of pocket? That's something that's long been a problem for New York because it's been disproportionate otherwise. But you have cities where they're paying $25 for a person to ride on a streetcar or whatever. Obviously, it's not in balance. From a local perspective, what can be done to try and find, in effect, the same kind of issue of what kind of money we're going to need for the things we're going to have to do?
Yeah, it's interesting because the Biden administration, as you know, in the two major laws that they passed, two separate provisions for mitigating the impact of existing highways. So either tearing the highways down, narrowing that roadbed, or burying some portion of the highway. And both Senator Schumer and Congressman Richie Torres have wanted some of that money to go toward covering a portion of the Cross Bronx Expressway. But this is, classic, same thing with the high-speed rail projects under the Obama era, spreading too small a pool of money around a country with too many of these projects to just overwhelm that pool of money. So you get a little bit for each individual project and not enough to actually complete a demonstration project. But absolutely, greater or a federal package to be matched by the state and city to cover up that 2-mile portion of the Cross Bronx that is buried in one segment. That would be terrific demonstration that not only did we escape the sort of near miss of building the Lower Manhattan and the Midtown Manhattan Expressway, but the expressway that we did build and that had a terrible, harmful effect on that mid-southern Bronx. We're not going to just continue to talk about it and lament it, but actually do something about it.
Hi, thank you, Nicole, for the book. I appreciate it. I learned
Sure.
so much. And I was involved with a lot of these programs, but so much new information. My question is, you mentioned New Jersey might have some reasonable points. I wonder whether the law that set up congestion pricing might be flawed, that it was just focused on raising $1 billion and not what it should accomplish transportation-wise. You think that narrow focus of the law might cause some of these lawsuits and other issues that we're facing?
Yes, having that artificial target that you have to raise $1 billion to $1.5 billion every year to fund this $15 billion borrowing, that really constrained the MTA. In other words, things like, why do they have to charge an overnight toll? The original Sam Schwartz Move New York plan entirely left New Jersey alone because of these bi-state political issues, but saying this is just as much a revenue program right from day one as it is a congestion program, really imperiled the flexibility that the MTA needed to at least have a chance of building some public support.
Hi.
Hi.
In this very room a couple of years ago, I asked Polly Trottenberg, and by the way, what Ross in New York law does with New York politics, New York policy is incredible. Nobody else, I went to a different law school, but nobody else does what New York law is doing here. Thank you. Thank you. In this room, I asked Polly Trottenberg, what would Robert Moses have thought? I went to law school at Hartford. I was one of the few black lifeguards at Jones Beach. I always told my kids about the story about why the bridges were a certain height. On the very day that Robert Moses died, we pulled into parking lot 6. I'm in my Porsche with my 2 little kids. And I said, Robert Moses just died. I said, who's Robert Moses? Well, he's the guy that made the bridges short so we couldn't come to the beach. I asked Polly Trottenberg, what would Robert Moses have thought about congestion prices? She looked at me, looked at Ross, and then said, Mr. Nicholson, I assure you Robert Moses is not in heaven thinking anything. He did not go to heaven. Why has the MTA, in a public relations point of view, failed so badly to make people understand that mass transit and the highways and roads are all tied together in a way that we're all together. I live on the Upper West Side. I have a country house in the Berkshires. I leave my car at Hudson. I catch the train down. I don't bring a car to Manhattan. You shouldn't have a car in Manhattan. Today, I was talking on WNYC about Lindsay's plan to build, there was a plan in the Lynch to build highways, to build throughways through lower Manhattan. Why would we think, had no idea that was ever considered. There are too many cars, too many roads. We don't need more vehicles in Manhattan, but until the MTA convinces the public that mass transit, cars, roads are all connected, we got a problem that's just never going to get fixed in my lifetime. Thanks for the book.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right. I wouldn't go so far as to say they failed, but there are things they could be doing with congestion pricing to remind people the transit trips and car trips are interrelated. So for example, this is all being done on EasyPass, the same credit card that people are using for their Omni account or just to tap into the subways with their credit card now. Nothing stopping the MTA from saying, and most people or many people have signed up for the text messages. So something like getting a text that says, "We noticed you used your car 3 times last week to drive into Manhattan. We'll give you a credit to try Metro North with it sometime within the next few weeks. Try it and see if you prefer that rather than taking the car." Sort of put these two things together in the MTA system, or something like, more flexibility in more free subway rides, the more rides that you take. They're doing a little bit of that, but not as much as cities like London have been doing, for decades now. So absolutely.
Before we get to our next question, I'm just going to say, let's end the line there just so we get to these last 5, and then we will, we'll break for buying and signing books and a couple more refreshments before we end our event. Please.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gelinas. I always admire your speech.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I attended your speech at Republican Club as well. I always think you're one of the most remarkable women speakers. And I was actually mentioning to everybody that how excited I'm going to listen to you again. And sure enough, this is a very, very important, critical topic, especially in New York City. And I just wonder, some of them already expressed what I wanted to know. And my question would be really short. What do you think when scientific development already cut off the tape to scapegoat environmental law, because we have more and more alternative energies for our vehicles, and also many more energy-saving strategies. So if without all those excuses to escape environmental law, how do we continue to utilize our transportation to serve the public needs while also mediate the overloading, overpopulated cosmopolitan areas?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Thank you very much. And certainly technology is great. It is good that, starting with the catalytic converter 50 years ago, and even before that, the emissions coming from any one vehicle have declined. We complied with the Clean Air Act's emissions requirements really without decreasing the traffic, which is both good and bad. But we have to be aware that we have to be in charge of the technology. The technology should not be in charge of us. So electric cars, certainly better to have an electric car than a car that is emitting on the street with hundreds of pedestrians walking by. But it is still a car, and it is still a private motor vehicle. We don't want exemptions for electric cars and other technology that undoes the result that we're trying to reach. Similar with Uber and Lyft, the city allowed itself to be controlled by the technology for a long time rather than recognize This is just another way of hailing a cab. We regulate the number of cabs for a reason. You cannot have an unlimited number of for-hire vehicles trawling the streets of Manhattan.
That's
Yes.
interesting. We already have an unlimited number of Uber vehicles
Mhm.
which are not regulated, but that's not my point. Having laws that help achieve the purposes we're here to discuss is great, but as you made clear, enforcing them and implementing them can be an entirely different thing. Thinking of small steps that can achieve a lot, we have existing laws that are not being enforced at all. The most obvious to me as a Manhattanite is 20% before the pandemic, now 35% of all the vehicles parked in my neighborhood on the Upper West Side have out-of-state plates, parked all night. That is not legal. New York State Motor Vehicle Bureau does not have the manpower, and New York City doesn't have the authority to try to regulate that. The Cross Bronx, which I have no choice, but I have to use regularly, trucks are in the left lane where they're not allowed. Now, perhaps they should be allowed if they're going to New Jersey. But if we discouraged this behavior by ending out-of-state registered vehicles from parking in New York City and prevented trucks from being in the left lane, the traffic would be so bad that they would find another route or another time of day to get from New England and Long Island to the rest of the United States. So it's the enforcement question. How do we get the state and the city, Department of Transportation, to enforce the existing laws?
Yeah, there is a big and growing gap between the law and enforcement of the law, which is not a good thing. And I would certainly agree in both of those areas.
Thank you. I've already bought your book. I look forward to reading
Thank
it.
you.
And I also enjoy your counter narrative opinions in the Post and Manhattan Institute. My questions: one, can you speculate on what New York City would look like today if we never built Moses's highways? And two, do you have any thoughts on the proposal by one mayoral candidate to make buses, but not subways, free of charge?
Yeah, I think those are great questions. And that brings us back to what Ben and I were talking about before. These highways and expressways and parkways are really not Moses projects. They were put in on the blueprint and put on the map in the late 1920s. They were the project of the regional plan, later became the Regional Plan Association. This blueprint was put together before Moses had any public prominence. He was just building up his public reputation and building his first major project, Jones Beach and the Southern State Parkway. All of these highways, expressways, parkways, these are here because the business community wanted them, the labor community wanted them, elected officials, state, local government wanted them. And for most of this time, until the beginning of the second half of the 20th century, the public also wanted them. You know, this idea that one man sort of tricked everybody in New York State and New York City into building a road system that it did not work, never made a lot of sense. Other cities around the world, not just in the US, also built in a similar fashion, made the same mistakes, and are just now undoing some of those mistakes. So I think if Moses had never have been born, let's set aside housing and parks, because I think that's a different part of the Moses legacy, but the road system would look much the same as it did.
Hi, thank you for your presentation, Nicole, and thank you for NYU for hosting this event. My name is Irving Lee. I am a lifetime New Yorker. I'm a small property owner. I am a retired transit worker. I was a retired motorman, and I operated those number 4 trains, by the way. But I'm critical about congestion pricing and its implementation. I'm part of New Yorkers Against Congestion Pricing Tax. I think it would have catastrophic economic consequences. And I am a longtime Chinatown resident. It would hit us terribly because we're a working class community and we rely on trucks to bring in the goods and the food sources for the working class in Chinatown and in New York in general. So it would affect me personally. But I think there's a problem with congestion pricing in that it provides a contradictory business model. And the fact that you're trying to reduce congestion and at the same time try to raise revenue. So that's contradictory right then and there. And I think it would have devastating consequences for my community because it's going to raise the cost of doing business. It's going to lower property values and it's going to drive down business and makes us terribly vulnerable to take over by larger property owners. But the question I have for you, and you brought it up about electric vehicles, because to me, that sounds like a potential game changer in terms of at least the pollution aspect of it. And the fact that Trump is threatening tariffs and reducing the amount of electric vehicles that come into the system, don't you think that's problematic? The fact that this is a way of dealing with the pollution question at the very least?
Yeah, no question, electric vehicles will deal with the locational pollution issue. They don't address the traffic issue. In some ways, they may make the traffic issue worse. But absolutely, the $1 billion annual revenue target on the MTA makes it harder for them to find that place on the curve where you are reducing congestion, but not also reducing revenue in a, just like with a cigarette tax or any type of tax, the optimal revenue should be zero. Of course, you're never going to get to zero, but having that artificial revenue that they have to target makes it harder to do that. Yes.
We talked, sorry, a little while ago about doing the wrong thing over and over again, then doing the right thing. We didn't quite talk about doing the right thing the wrong way, but we'll save that for after. Yeah.
Good evening. I think it's telling that maybe the only representative from the Transit Authority tonight here is the gentleman who spoke before me. That speaks volumes. Secondly, I read the New York Times online, and when I see articles about transportation issues, I love to read the comments. And the comments are replete with what is going to happen with this $1 billion. The Transit Authority is corrupt, it's wasteful, it's incompetent. So it seems to me that the issue now is, assuming this $1 billion comes in, is what, if anything, can be done to clean up the incompetence of the Transit Authority. Do you have any thoughts on that?
They certainly have to look seriously at the cost issue, but I would caution against only focusing on the MTA and not on the broader political issues at the state level, because a lot of constraints under which the MTA operates are created by state law. Much of what increases their costs are creation of state lawmakers and governors who then hide behind the MTA.
So what can citizens groups do about that? Nothing much, huh?
No, I think the same thing we're doing. Learn and, some people do activism. Some people do activism and policy through the law. And of course, just being informed and voting.
Thank you.
Thanks to Nicole Gelinas for being here tonight.
Thank you.
Please let Nicole make her way to the back table. And if you want to talk to her back there, because she's going to sign some books as people purchase those. And thank you again, everyone, for being here tonight. Thank you.